So have you heard of this thing called the torso ghost?
Gary lolled his head over the back of the couch, half-empty beer bottle in hand, while Renee sat on the floor and fiddled with her digital camera. It was a typical Friday night. None of us had much of anything to do, so cheap beer and campy horror movies were the order of the evening. By midnight, we'd all be half drunk and scaring each other silly with whichever weird story we can think up or pull from the internet. I shook my head. No, is that a new one?
Sort of.
Gary replied.
I found it on that urban legend site last week. Actually has a lot to do with that old warehouse past the docks. You know, the one that used to make bombs and stuff?
We did know that place. Everyone did. It was a hotbed of local rumor and paranormal tales. There had been a number of accidents there during the building's tenure as a munitions factory, and a plaque bearing the names of a few dozen workers still adorned the outside wall near the door. Naturally, that amount of pain and death in one place would produce a bumper crop of ghost stories, whether anything was actually going on or not. Renee put down her camera as Gary went on.
Well, see, there were lots of workers that got maimed and stuff, right? 'Cause of the machinery. And this one guy, he was walking by one of the big ones and got pulled in and ripped to pieces before anyone could help him. When they finally got the thing to stop, the only thing they pulled out was his torso. His arms and legs had been crushed and torn to bits, and his head was squished like a pumpkin.
He gave a morbid grin.
They probably had to hose blood and brains out of the gears for weeks.
Ew!
Renee thumped his leg and made a face.
Dude, that's gross.
Oh, it gets better.
Gary insisted, grinning even wider to spite her.
They buried the guy, just his torso, because they couldn't find enough of his limbs or his head to put in the coffin. They say he still haunts the factory.
What? With the other 30 or so dead workers? I broke in. Doesn't it get a little crowded?
He probably doesn't take up much space. See, it's only his torso that people see.
Just a torso?
Renee's tone carried a distinct scoff.
How does that even work? Does he float around or just sort of flop across the floor or what?
Neither. He just sort of turns up, propped in corners of rooms.
Gary took a swig of his beer.
People see him for a second in flashlight beams or camera flashes.
Well, that doesn't sound very scary, I said. Gross, sure, but...
It's scary enough if you happen to take a picture of him by accident.
Gary shot back.
You see, he's angry about the way he died, and even angrier that the factory didn't bother to try to find the rest of him before he was buried. He wants his limbs back, so they say.
He lowered his voice to a theatrical Vincent Price whisper.
They say he steals limbs from the living. If you take his picture, he'll come and find you and rip off bits of you to make himself complete again.
That sounds like a load of crap.
Renee stood and went to get a beer of her own.
Good for scaring the kiddies, though.
We could go and find out, you know. It's not that far from here. We could drive over in like half an hour and see for ourselves.
What? Are you nuts?
No, seriously.
Gary bounded up and leaned over the back of the sofa.
Let's do it. We'll go check it out tonight.
So that was how the three of us wound up in a car, questionably sober, and heading for a crumbling old warehouse on the waterfront. Renee and I weren't totally on board, but Gary was jazzed enough for all three of us. The place was dark when we pulled up and completely silent, except for the distant sound of waves on pylons.
All right.
Gary crowed.
Let's go hunt us a ghost.
He vaulted out of the car. Renee shot me a "can you believe this idiot" look, and we followed him. We pulled ourselves up on an open landing dock and went inside. As expected, it was pitch black. Gary and I clicked on the flashlights we'd brought with us, and Renee clicked on her camera.
All right, genius,
she said in tones of barely restrained sarcasm.
Now what?
You're the photographer. You tell me.
Gary shot back. How about a group shot to test the camera? I suggested, just to keep them from bickering. This seemed to do the trick. Renee set the camera on a barrel by the door and set the timer. We posed against a wall of corrugated metal, Charlie's Angels style, like a bunch of dorks. The flash blinded all of us for a second. While we stood there blinking the spots out of our eyes, something clanked in the darkness.
Dude, already?
Gary flashed his light into the open doorway behind us.
That was quick.
I tried to tell him not to get excited, that it might have just been a chain moving in the wind or a piece of rusted out equipment shifting. But Gary wasn't listening. He ran off into the darkness before either of us could stop him.
Oh, hell.
Renee muttered. We ran after him, but the factory floor was a maze of chain-link partitions and hulking hunks of metal that were once state-of-the-art machinery. Gary didn't respond to our calls of his name. We looked for the flickering beam of his flashlight, but no luck there either. Gary, where the hell are you? I yelled.
Shh!
Renee hissed. Her nail suddenly dug into my arm.
Did you hear that?
I paused, listening. For a few seconds there was nothing. Then there was a low, soft, scraping sound somewhere nearby. Something was sliding across the cement floor, scratching and grating softly as it went. My blood froze in my veins. The image of the dead man's mangled torso flashed in my head, a bloody headless thing dragging itself across the floor by the stumps of bone protruding from its severed limbs. The sound came nearer, inch by inch. With every scrape, my heart gave a painful jerk against my ribs, and Renee's nails sank deeper into the sleeves of my jacket. Scrape. 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 It was only feet away now. Renee shrieked, and I brought my flashlight up, futilely thinking it might be a weapon.
Holy balls, that's bright.
Gary threw his hands up to block the glare. Renee punched him.
You asshole! The hell were you doing running off like that?
I found something. Come on.
Without waiting for an answer, he took off. Again. What could we do but follow him? Fortunately, this time he stayed in range of my flashlight, and we found ourselves standing in front of a particularly large and decrepit-looking piece of machinery that sported a giant wheel on one side.
This is it.
Gary told us with a triumphant spread of his arms, as if this were an art exhibit and he just unveiled his masterpiece.
This is it.
This is what? Renee and I said almost in unison. He pointed to some odd brown stains on the metal, grating beneath his feet.
Those have to be bloodstains. I bet this is the machine that...
We froze. Staring. The wheel had just moved. It was the barest inch of a turn, but the damn thing moved. Creak. Another couple of inches. Something clunked ominously, and with a tortured screech of old metal, the wheel began to turn.
Gary!
Renee said in a terrified whisper.
Gary, get away from there!
No way. This is what we came to see. Come on, take a picture. Let's see if we can catch the ghost.
Gary's grin was practically maniacal as he stood beside the slowly awaking machine. It was at the exact moment when I decided I had just about enough and was stepping forward to put an end to things by dragging his fool ass out of here, if I had to. That's when everything went straight to hell. Gary's foot slipped on the grating. Before Renee or I could reach him, both his legs had been pulled under the wheel. The scream that echoed off those walls was one I don't think I'll ever be able to get out of my head. It went on and on, hoarse and ugly, underlined by wet, crunching sounds as the wheel gained momentum and the rusted metal turned dark and wet. With a sickening lurch, we managed to pull Gary out of the gears, but it was too late. His legs were mangled, stumps pumping crimson puddles onto the floor. His skin was already turning waxy, his pupils fixed and unresponsive. "Oh shit," I heard myself say. "Oh shit."
We gotta get out of here.
Renee's voice shook.
We gotta get help.
A clank from the machine was all it took to send us running. Though the labyrinth of factory floor back towards the entrance, we practically flew, barely seeing our way by the beam of the flashlight. The open bay was a patch of lighter darkness, and we aimed for it at full speed. I practically dove off the landing dock, landing hard on the asphalt and turning back to help Renee down. I started digging for my cell phone to call. I don't know, an ambulance would have pretty much been pointless, and we were trespassing, so the cops were out of the question. Suddenly, Renee turned back.
Shit! I left my camera.
"Renee, wait!" She ran back to the loading dock and tried to haul herself up on it. I heard a snap and a screech of metal, and could only watch in horror as the bay door came crashing down. Renee's scream split the night like a siren, and she staggered back, both arms neatly severed just above the elbow. Red gore painted streaks down the lip of the loading dock. Right about then is when everything went black. I woke up in the hospital 2 days later. The cops badgered me about our reasons for being there, took my statement about the ghost story, the machine that moved on its own, and what had happened to Gary and Renee. They told me Gary never made it out of the factory. He'd lost too much blood, and he'd breathed his last right there on the metal grating where we'd left him. Renee is still in a coma. The doctors weren't optimistic about her chances due to the trauma inflicted by the falling bay door, but in the end, she pulled through. After the investigation wrapped up, I finally got out of the intensive care. They gave me Renee's camera. Somehow it had remained intact and undisturbed, on that barrel just inside the door. I borrowed a laptop and flicked through the photos on the memory card. I don't know what I was looking for. I think I just wanted to see their faces again. Wanted to try to overwrite the awful images etched on the inside of my skull. There were only a dozen or so, but it helped. Pictures of the three of us drinking beer, making goofy faces, grinning like idiots. I felt a lump rising in my throat. Gary had been kind of a dumbass sometimes, but we'd been friends since grade school, and I was going to miss him terribly. I looked at the picture of Renee balancing a bottle on one finger and tried to wrap my brain around the idea that she'd never be able to drink on her own again without help, or a prosthetic. The very last picture was the one we'd taken upon entering the factory. I almost didn't want to look at it. I didn't want to see those last moments we'd spent together before... It took a half hour of hovering over the next button before I finally summoned up the strength to click. There we were, in what was probably the worst Charlie's Angel trio pose ever. I laughed in spite of myself and felt my eyes prickle with tears. The upward angle of the flash had reflected strangely on the corrugated metal, making our shadows loom above us like harbingers of doom. Then I saw it. In the edge of the photo was a skinny black rectangle that marked the doorway Gary had run through. I could only see half of it, but that was enough. In the very bottom of the doorway was a pale, mangled-looking lump. I somehow knew what it was before I fully processed exactly what I was looking at. It was a limbless human torso. We'd been feet away from that thing when the flash went off. Gary was the closest, Renee was in the middle, and then me. As I stared at the photo, trying to find some other explanation, trying to think of anything that didn't involve vengeful, limb-ripping ghosts, I noticed something else. Our shadows weren't just distorted. They were incomplete. Gary had lost his legs. Gary's shadow had no legs. Renee lost her arms. Renee's shadow had no arms. And now, I'm terrified to leave this hospital. Terrified to go anywhere outside of my room. Terrified of what's waiting for me out there. Because in the photo, my shadow had no head. I'd like to thank Unit and HorrorJunkie for doing narration parts in this. I think it turned out really well. It's been a long time coming since Bree sent me her story, and she sent it a while ago, and I wanted to save it for around Halloween time. And, I wanted Unit in it, and HorrorJunkie, so I hope it was worth the wait, Bree. It was a great story, it was fun to narrate, it was fun to edit. So, ghouls, I hope you enjoyed it. It's almost Halloween. Don't forget we're doing a Sunday night stream instead of Saturday night, because we're going to do like a Halloween stream. So yeah. Secret word or question? I don't really have one, so I apologize. I don't have one today. But as always, the last video will be on the top left. The next video will be on the bottom left. All my social medias are on the screen as well as in the description box below. And remember, there's always someone or something watching you.